In this segment of human capital investment, I'd like to take a look at the demand for higher education. I want to do that because all of us are participants in higher education. You as students at this point, many of you realize that I only fairly recently completed my doctoral education in economics. And so we've both been participants in higher education very recently. It's important to both of us. But I'd also like to take a look at externalities. Externalities being the unintended consequences of economic transactions, or frankly, any action or transaction. To do this, I want to start by looking at a cost-benefits model where we're looking at earnings over some period of time, earnings that we might have had without our education versus earnings that we might have had with education. And earnings in this case is going to be an aggregate value. So in the education experience, we have to have some negative value assessed here because of higher education costs and such. So if we look at this, I'd like to give us a y-axis that is actually going to go well below our zero bound. On the y-axis, we're looking at some level of earnings, maybe wages plus cost. So this is net earnings. And over on our x-axis, we're going to look at some measure of time. Well, if we think about this, during our education experience, we probably have, for some period of time, say the number of years we're in school, we have some negative earnings. We're actually spending money. We're making the investment. In our prior example, we were spending $15,000 a year, plus we had lost some income that we could have otherwise had. And then at this point in time where we start to have an income again, then we move from the zero bound quickly at that point in time to the positive bound, and then we can say that our earnings trajectory over time, I'm going to call this E, our earnings trajectory over time, will perhaps have this modest slope to it as we receive pay increases and such. Well, how does that compare then to our earnings trajectory and some other value that we might be able to think about? Well, clearly, had I not had this opportunity cost and such, I perhaps would have started out with a earnings that may not have been all that much different than my initial level. Maybe it starts out here, and I've got some trajectory, but the trajectory probably flattens out at the point. This maybe looks as though it went negative. I didn't intend that. I'm just intending it to look as though it's flatter. And we're going to call this E prime. E prime. Well, how do we identify then when or whether or not this is valuable? Think of this area here all as an area of some opportunity cost, maybe some opportunity loss, where we've created a deficit, if you will, of what we did experience because of this education earnings experience versus what we could have had. And then think about the area on this side after we've hit this confluence where our earnings are expanded over and above what they would have been otherwise. This area on the right as being some net value. So if we start at a net cost and we end up at a net positive, how long will it take for the net positive to be as great as the net cost? This initial point is kind of a break-even for income. So that simply means a point at which our income is now greater than it would have been otherwise. But it's at some point here in the future where our real break-even occurs, where the sum of all of our positive values, our excess, our surplus, if you will, is equal to or greater than our cost. This is a cost-benefits model if you think about this education human capital investment experience. Let's look at some statistics now that help us understand or get a slightly better grasp on earnings and education and the positive correlation with them. So here once again we see our cost benefits model. Here we're looking at earnings by education level. And we can see, and this should be no surprise to you, that as we have different years here on the x-axis, 1998 through 2010, and different median earnings level on the y-axis, we find that for these years, we see what different levels of income are garnered by those simply with a high school education versus those with an associate's degree, bachelor's degree, master's, doctorate, and professional degree. It's interesting. One might suppose that a doctorate, which is probably the terminal degree that one might be able to have in higher education, it's the highest available degree to be earned, that might allow one to have the highest amount of income. But we find that's not necessarily true, largely because so many people with doctorates go into research, analysis, and higher education, which is an extraordinary career, very gratifying, but it may not have some of the financial rewards that other careers that employ advanced degrees might have. So what would we call that then? What would that difference in income be? We would think of that as a compensating wage differential, of course. What we see here as you go up the education spectrum, with the exception of a doctorate degree, that we clearly increase in income as well. We may have to think about this more than just as income. What about the consistency of income? Well, we see here in this next graphic that over time, 1992 to a projected 2017, here we're terminating at about 2013, we see unemployment percentages. And we find those, excuse me, we find those that are college graduates have a lower unemployment rate consistently than those that are high school graduates and than those that have even less than high school. So we find that education is not only positively correlated with income, but it's beneficially correlated with the consistency of income as well. Let's look at this a little bit further and think about some of the externalities that we're thinking about here or considering with higher education. Remember that an externality is nothing but an unintended consequence. And some of them will be economic, some may be physical or health related, some might be social. Well, the economic externalities clearly is a higher level of income, as we've seen in the prior graphs, and more consistency of income. But also then, higher education means you have more money so that you can accumulate wealth. If you have higher incomes, you likely have a greater ability to save, so you can accumulate wealth, as opposed to if you have very low incomes, that might be terribly difficult. So one of the externalities is an accumulation of wealth that you might not have been able to have otherwise. Another externality is those with a higher level of education tend to receive lower costs for credit, lower insurance costs, lower rates of credit default. If we think about this in terms of health and physical attributes, we find positive correlations between levels of education and health, levels of education and length of life, lower cost of health care, because we tend to be better informed, we tend to make better health-related decisions, lower levels of long-term drug use, lower rates of alcoholism, lower suicide rates, which also then means lower incarceration rates, lower long-term costs. If we think about this with respect to some of the social externalities, we find that those with higher investments in education have higher rates of volunteerism and philanthropy. We presume these to be positively correlated with beneficial utility. We find they have higher rates of political activism. We have higher rates of marriage and longer periods of marriage, lower rates of divorce. We find that there are smaller family sizes, and some people would say, well, that would be a negative externality. Some people that value a large family, other people are going to find that as a positive externality. It just depends on your expectations, your institutional construct, if you will. We find that people which are more highly educated tend to have higher levels of religious involvement. And then finally, lower rates of criminal activity. These would be some of the externalities associated with higher levels of education. So this goes well beyond simply thinking about the income and production value that we might associate with this type of capital investment. We might be able to look at this exact same set of economic, physical, and social attributes as it relates to investments in immigration or as it relates to investments in healthcare. They'll be a little bit different, of course, but we find by and large that there are significant positive externalities that are associated with investment in human capital that go well beyond that which can easily be measured in a value proposition.